Alright, so today we are going to be talking about slides 12 through 17, and that includes transitions. We have 3 slides that are about dialogue, 1 about sensory details, and then we'll start talking about dynamic resolutions, how you're going to end your story. So the first one is transitions. And let's read the directions or the instructions up at the top. It says, transition words and phrases are like bridges that connect the story elements. They help move the plot sequence smoothly, they show setting and time shifts, and they emphasize important plot details. So they have lots of examples of different transitions that you can use. These ones, I know this font is kind of silly, these ones show location. So it shows where something is near. And this kind of helps you tell the reader where your character is located, or where your setting is currently located, or where it's going to be located. The next set is ones that show time and sequence. So these can help move your story forward by telling your reader something is going to happen, in the next day, or afterward, or later. It can tell your reader that. It can also tell your reader that more things are going to happen, because if you say like first, then that tells us, oh, there's probably going to be a second if they're telling me first. The next one, show importance and emphasis. These words, like it says, shows your reader that something is important. Literally, it says the most important or the least important. So those show importance and emphasis. And remember, emphasis means that it's something you want your reader to notice. Down here at the very bottom, it says try it, add transitions to this passage. So what I want you to do is read through the passage, type in the text box, one of these transition words for each text box that you think would work really well for this little story. And then once we get writing, we are going to make sure we find places in our narrative that could be made more clear by using a transition word or phrase. Our next slide is about dialogue. So I am going to be giving you the answers to this. So you will need to be typing them into your text box. So make sure you're getting ready right now. Have that split screen open so you can be listening and typing at the same time. At the top, it says dialogue is a character's exact spoken words. And then we have a speaker tag. We have not talked about this yet. It says a speaker tag identifies the speaker and tells how they're speaking. Then let's read the little paragraph right here in the purple box. It says, class, who remembers the chemical formula for water? Asked the teacher. Michael raised his hand and said, pick me, I know it. Michael, said the teacher, please share the formula with the class. I sure will, responded Michael. It is HIJKLMNO. Michael, that is not funny, said the teacher. Michael shrugged his shoulders and answered, but just yesterday you said it's H2O. Ha ha ha. Okay, number 1 says, what do you notice about the paragraphing that is used? What do I notice? I notice that every time a new person talks, there is a new paragraph. So I'm going to say what I notice about the paragraphing that is used is that every time a new person talks, a new paragraph starts. There we go. Number 2, feel free to pause the video if you need to in order to get that typed in. Number 2, what do you notice about the punctuation and capitalization in lines 1 and 2? Well, I notice that we have a capital letter here at the beginning of when somebody speaks, and even though there's a question mark right here, which means it's the end of a sentence, the A in asked is not capitalized. So I'm going to say the C in class is capitalized at the beginning of the dialogue, and there is a question mark at the end of the dialogue. The speaker tag is not capitalized. Feel free to pause the video so you can get that typed in. Number 3, what do you notice about the punctuation and capitalization in line 3? Okay, for this one, if I'm looking at it, I have a capital letter right here. It's a person's name, so we know it's a proper noun, which means it would have to be capitalized. And then after our speaker tag, we have a comma, and then we have a capital letter at the beginning of our dialogue. So the beginning of the speaker tag is capitalized because it is the beginning of a sentence, and the dialogue is also capitalized. There you go. Number 4, what do you notice about lines 4 and 5? Alright, 4 says, Michael, said the teacher, please share the formula with the class. Oh, I notice that the speaker tag is in the middle of the dialogue. You could also say the speaker tag is not capitalized. Alright, how is line 6 different from lines 4 and 5? Okay, so it says, Michael, so line 4 and 5 says, Michael, said the teacher, please share the formula with the class. And then line 6 says, I sure will, responded Michael. It's HIJKLMNO. So what I notice is that there's a period right here after the speaker tag, because I sure will is a complete sentence, and that's his first response, and then he says it's HIJKLMNO, which is also capitalized and has its own period there. So that's kind of a lot, but we'll try and squeeze it in. I'm going to say there is a, let's say these lines are different because in 6 there is a period after the speaker tag, and in 4 through 5 there is not. Oops. There we go. Alright, now this one says, how are lines 1 and 2 different from line 7? So 1 and 2 says, class, who remembers the chemical formula for water? Asks the teacher. And then line 7 says, Michael, that is not funny, said the teacher. So what do we notice is different? We have our quotation marks in a capital letter, we have a question mark right here, and then it says, ask the teacher. Our speaker tag is not capitalized. And then in 7 it says, Michael, that is not funny, said the teacher. So I noticed that we have a question mark here and just a comma right here, and guess what? Both of those are correct. So dialogue can be done lots of different ways. Let's see, lines 1 through 2 and 7 are different because 1 has a question mark at the end of the dialogue, and the other has a comma. Both are done correctly. So you'll notice there are lots of different ways that dialogue can be done. This slide and the next 2 slides are great resources for you to look at to make sure your dialogue is done correctly, or to look for a variety of ways to do dialogue in your narrative. Let's look at 14. This one is just kind of some, or I guess, rules for how the dialogue is done in this paragraph, the same paragraph as the last slide. So it says, dialogue is a character's exact spoken words. A speaker tag identifies the speaker and tells how the character is speaking. This is the same set of dialogue that we just read, but we have the rules here. So in the entire passage, you'll see that you begin a new paragraph with every new speaker. In the entire passage, you'll see that you always begin a quote with a capital letter. So every time we have that dialogue with the quotation marks, it always has a capital letter. This one is a name, this one is not. They're both capitalized. Quotation marks go before and after dialogue, so they should be right next to the letter or the punctuation, that is your dialogue. We do not put a space in between the dialogue and the letter, or the punctuation at the end and the quotation marks. We don't put any spaces. Punctuation goes inside the closing quotes. You see it right here. If we have a question mark here, it goes question mark, then quotation marks. Exclamation point, then quotation marks. Same thing with our comma. Comma, then quotation marks. So our punctuation always goes inside. We use a comma after a speaker tag if it is before the dialogue. So what lines was that? 3 and 8. So in line 3 we have our speaker tag first, then a comma, and then our dialogue. Same thing in line 8. In line 7 it says use a comma after the dialogue if it comes before the speaker tag. So in line 7 we'll see that we have a comma right here, and then we have our speaker tag. In line 1 and 2 it says unless the dialogue is a question or an exclamation. So we have this exclamation point and a question mark, and we have, let's see, and then we don't, so there's no comma after that dialogue right there. In lines 4 and 5, if the speaker tag interrupts a line of dialogue, so that means if the speaker tag goes in the middle of the dialogue, use commas to separate it. Do not use a capital letter after the speaker tag. That's line 4 and 5. So we have dialogue, something someone says, then we have a speaker tag, comma, more dialogue, and it says do not use a capital letter right here, because this is part of the same sentence. Michael and please share the formula, those are both in the same sentence. And this one's a little different. It says if the speaker tag interrupts 2 sentences, use a period after the speaker tag, start a new line with a capital letter. So in line 6, we have dialogue here. This is a full sentence, remember. And then we have our speaker tag with a period at the end. And then we have another sentence after the speaker tag. And this one also starts with a capital letter and has its own punctuation. So this is a great slide to refer back to when you're creating your dialogue in your narrative. We're going to look at slide 15 now. Dialogue serves many important purposes in a narrative. It helps establish the setting, shows characterization, which kind of gives more details about the characters in your text. It foreshadows events, so it can tell us that something is coming. If a character in your story notices and says something, it shows the reader that something is coming. It can help advance the action, that just means that it can help your story move forward. When writing dialogue, we do not want to include too much dialogue. If your entire story is dialogue, you haven't included enough narration, and that means just telling the story. Dialogue must sound believable, so we want to make it sound like somebody's actually talking. If you wouldn't normally say, I am going to go to the mall today, don't put that in your text. Don't put that in your narrative. You want to write, I'm going to go to the mall today. So you want to make it sound like somebody is actually talking. And here's the last one. You know this would drive me crazy, right? Dialogue does not have to be grammatically correct, but it must sound natural. So we do want to spell it correctly because we want our reader to be able to read what we're saying in our story, and we want them to be able to understand it. However, you could write gonna instead of going to if that's the way somebody would actually talk. Down here it says make your narrative more interesting by including dialogue. Find a place in your narrative where dialogue can establish the setting, show characterization, foreshadow events, advance the action. So this is just different ways to include dialogue in your story. Slide 16. Bring your narrative, sensory details. Bring your narrative to life. Go through your draft and decide how many sensory details you can add. Your narrative will be sensational. So what I want you to think about right here, what is a main setting in your text, a main event or place like it says here? Put it in right here. So if your story mostly takes place at a school, you would type in school here. And then think about, okay, if I was sitting there in this setting or event, what would I hear? And type in some things that you might hear. If the setting was at school, you might hear kids talking, teachers talking, you might hear the school bell ringing, you might hear, I don't know, if you're in Mrs. Mendoza's classroom, you might hear people stomping upstairs occasionally. Visual details. What are some things that you might see while you're there? Smells, think about the smells that you might smell while you're at that event or place. Feelings, maybe you think about what kind of feelings you would be feeling. Maybe you're walking through and, I don't know, walking through the pod during passing time and you feel people bumping up against you. You feel the texture of your desk or a pencil, or maybe it's cold in your classroom or hot in your classroom. Maybe it's lunchtime and you're outside and you feel the wind. So just thinking about all of the different things you would feel in this box, and then taste. So this one might be kind of tricky to do for school, but maybe it takes place at lunch and you're putting some of the details in there of what you would taste at lunch. Now what it says down here in this box, try it. Avoid telling readers what to notice and use vivid details to help readers visualize. So instead of saying, I saw Mrs. Mendoza standing up at the front of the class, maybe you would help them visualize it by saying something like, class, it's time to get started, Mrs. Mendoza said from the front of the room. So that's kind of a way of, instead of saying, Mrs. Mendoza stood at the front of the class and said this, it's what you would actually see and hear if you were that character. So adding sensory details makes your story a lot better, but it can be a little tricky to do. You might need to come back to this slide while you're actually writing your narrative in order to make sure you get some of these details in your writing. Alright, our last slide for today. It seems like a lot to try and think of your resolution when we haven't even started writing our draft yet, but I just want you to think about how your story is going to end. So the first one is dialogue. And dialogue is one way to end it. The nickname TJ is after my father, Grandpa said. TJ stands for Tin Man Jr. So you could have dialogue be the way you end your story, and it would be something, interesting for the reader to read. This one says an action, and it says, I drove off into the sunset confident that I would continue learning about my own strengths. So it kind of tells us, yes, it tells us an action, but it tells us a little bit more about what could happen in the future too. This one says reflection or lesson. The score showed that they lost the game, but in his heart, Robert knew they had won something much more important, friendship. So that tells us what the lesson was. Kind of gives us an idea of the theme. This one says an irony or surprise. I have an appointment tonight with him, or I have an appointment with him tonight in Damascus. So that was from where'd it go? The mentor text that we read, Death Comes to Baghdad. So that's kind of a surprise for the reader that he was, heading towards his own fate. That could be something that you try in your story. And then full circle. Full circle would mean you kind of swing back to the beginning of your story and wrap it up by referring back to something you talked about in the beginning. And it says, oh, and I'm certainly sleeping better too. So maybe that was an issue at the beginning of the story. Alright, down here it says, try it. Provide a plot resolution that flows naturally from the events in your story. Think about the feelings, thoughts, or questions that you want to leave with the readers. Try not to rely on a cliche such as, he woke up to discover it was all a dream. So even if your story does end up being a dream, let's make it a little bit more creative than that. And then the last one says, remember that endings can be happy or sad. They don't always have to be that happy, perfect ending that's, the package tied up with a pretty bow on top. Sometimes it can be a sad ending or, an ending that your reader wouldn't expect. So what I want you to do, I want you to do all 5 of these. I want you to give all 5 of them a try. So all of the different ways of wrapping up your story, and then once we get to actually finishing up our rough draft, you'll be able to choose one of these, the one that's your best. The best one that you think wraps up your story in the best way. So go ahead and get working on all of these slides if you haven't already. Please make sure you refer back to this video if you need to. And then I'll remind you too, just in case. You're writing these ones on this dynamic resolution for your story. I got asked many, many times about that, where is it, the introduction one, the magnetic leads. Are we writing this for our own story, even though right here it says the first sentence of your entire story that you could use for your story? So it's the same thing with our resolutions. This works for your story. You are writing possible last sentences for your story here. If you do have any questions or get stuck, need help, let me know. Maybe you could whisper chat with your neighbor if you have any questions that they could answer for you. Otherwise, get working.